Well, welcome back, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Advancing Our Church. I'm so pleased to have with us Hans Plate, the founder and president of Vinea Research. Hans, welcome to the program. Glad to have you with us today.
Hello, Jim. Happy to be here.
So let me just provide for our listeners a little introduction to Hans and a little bit about his firm, and then we'll get right into it. Hans' firm focuses on the science of market research on organizations that serve the Catholic Church to provide a higher caliber, action-oriented market research to parishes, church leadership, apostolates, and advocacy groups. Hans brings more than 25 years of experience providing professional market research to industry-leading companies such as Pfizer and Medtronic. And today we're going to learn more about Hans, his firm, and the new report that they just published on the impact of COVID-19 on Catholic lives. Again, welcome, Hans. Have such great, tremendous respect for your work. And I think the value that this report is going to bring to parishes, because I think speaking as somebody who's worked at the diocesan level and somebody who's worked at the parish level, I think there's something in this for everybody, and whether or not they want to look at the macro or just how this impacts them at home. I was really impressed with the scope of your report.
Well, that was my desire, was to provide information that pastors could use specifically to just to understand a little bit about their flock, right? So my background is in market research that I mentioned in the commercial world, and we refer to it as customer insights, not so much market research, even though technically is what it is.
Right.
But it's, again, getting the insights into the constituency that you serve so that you can better serve them, right? So the more informed you are, the better decisions you can hopefully make. And the more diagnostic information you have in a way, again, you know what, as a physician, you have to ask, so what hurts? And then you can do something about the hurt. And so, maybe a little bit, more philosophical than I intended, but that's kind of what I was hoping to do with this particular project. And it is somewhat comprehensive. So I touch on a few different subjects, and I can only go so deep in them. My hope is to really get into some of these topics a little bit more deeply in future studies as well.
Absolutely. Well, first, let's take a step back. And I know you come from the market research, the science of market research before you formed this company, but tell us a little bit about Vinea Research.
So it does start with me, since I founded the company.
Sure.
And my background was in essentially healthcare research.
Okay.
A lot of the work we did there was pre-launch. So in the years prior to a medication being approved for use, they would do all sorts of work in better understanding who their target audience is. So, for example, if you're developing a new medication for diabetes, also understand about the people with diabetes, the doctors who treat it, and you do a whole bunch of projects and studies that basically you get to know the customers so well that when I was going through a process of discerning the diaconate, one of the talks we had on our RCIA team that I was a part of as the team was around time, talent, and treasure.
Okay.
And time, it's easy to conceptualize, right? You just volunteer or give of your time. Treasure, the same idea, donate to different causes. But it was the talent part that really got me thinking about how do I do that? Is there any talent that I have that I could apply to the church? And there was, which is just providing information, which is exactly the case. And so after that, it became a slow process of trying to figure out, well, how do I actually do this? And I formed Vinea Research basically to do that. And over my years of doing research in the commercial world, what I did is I made a lot of contacts, of course, moderators, statisticians, project managers. And so I reached out to a lot of the ones that I respected, and I basically asked them questions about the faith. Where are you with the faith? And lo and behold, several of them were Catholic. And so some of them were just Christian. And so brought them on board to help round out our offerings with Vinea Research.
Wonderful. Tell me a little bit about the name. Why Vinea Research?
So naming a company is a very difficult thing because you have to find words that are meaningful and then domains that are available. Mm-hmm. And so I was struggling mightily with the name, but I was reading and reflecting on John 15. And I was just struck by the fact that Jesus says, "Abide in me and I will abide in you." And the whole abiding was just mind-blowing to me, really, to believe that we can have such a close union and relationship with Jesus. And so, the whole concept of the vineyard and the vine, I am the true vine, it just struck me that really we are then part of, we make up the vineyard. And so that's the origin of the word. And Vinea is a Latin rendering of vine and vineyard. And so that's how I finally came to that particular name.
I am the vine, you are the branches. I think that was one of our most recent gospel readings in the daily reading.
I know, I was very excited. I get very excited every time I hear that, it's part of Mass. So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's us. No,
exactly.
That's great. Hans, tell us a little bit about this study. For those who aren't familiar with it, I am going to put a link in our show notes so that our listeners can find it easily online. But if you could just give us a little bit of an overview of what you measured and some of the results that you received.
One of the first things I did, actually, the idea for this particular study came from a pastor friend who said, and he knew what I did for a living. And he said, we just don't have good data on Catholics and the impact that COVID has had on them and what their future intentions are. And so I took that, and then I had additional conversations with other pastors and associate pastors from different parts of the country. We formed an instrument to measure this. And this is research that we funded ourselves. We did it as part of Vinea. We administered the instrument, the survey, and then we refined it, and then finally administered this one. And so this is one that was ultimately completed with a little bit, or by over 1,500 Catholics across the country, using a panel company called Dynata, which is one of the larger consumer panels. We use them in commercial research all the time. And there were two requirements to participate in the survey. One is that they self-identify as Catholic. The other is that they go to Mass at least once a year. But really, we focused on those who go to Mass more often. So this is predominantly a survey among those who go to Mass monthly or weekly. So for example, of the 1,500, 955, prior to pandemic anyway, went to Mass weekly or more often. So that's the general gist of the survey or of the audience that we surveyed. The survey itself had a few different components to it. The first was just a general overview of what kind of impact did COVID have on people's lives, Catholics' lives. Some of them were faith related, others were not. So it was just a general question. And then we went into specifically the impact on faith lives, and then Mass attendance, streaming, and then future intent of both physically going to Mass as well as contribution levels to the church. So that's, I guess, the overview of what went into the survey and how it came about.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And were there results that kind of surprised you when the results came back?
A little bit. I try to approach these as objectively as possible, right?
Sure.
Because I don't want to have any bias when I analyze the results.
Yeah.
But inevitably, I do have my own,
of course,
perceptions of what the findings might look like, and that's
right.
also helpful when reviewing whether or not there were any mistakes in the programming or the analysis that we did. But anyway, I think what didn't surprise me, first of all, was that COVID did have a varied impact on Catholics, right? Just like any other group. I mean, the Catholic population is a very diverse population, and so the impact of COVID is going to be pretty significant. So right off the bat, it's roughly a third who said that their lives today are either the same as, worse than, or better than they were prior to the pandemic. The slightly larger group, 39%, indicated that their lives are slightly worse off today than it was before the pandemic. But then what was surprising to me is that we later asked the question about faith in God and has it changed over the course of the pandemic? And what we found is that no, that it didn't, but that it didn't correlate with how their lives were affected. So even among the 39% who say their lives are worse off,
yeah,
their faith in God has not diminished. If anything, it's grown a little bit for many. So largely speaking, people's faith in God either stayed the same or grew, which was a little bit surprising. I expected to be a strong relationship between how they fared over the course of the pandemic and what their faith in God would be like, but that wasn't the case at all, which is a pleasant surprise, of course. Mm-hmm.
Also not surprising to hear that some folks' life, a lot of the folks' life the quality of life might not be what it was pre-pandemic, especially given what the economy has been doing this year. What was the time span when you conducted the survey? Was it late last year in 2021 or?
No, it was fresher than that. It was February of this year.
February. Okay, February. That's
second half of February. So we're out of Omicron. It's really the timing of this is kind of like, so what's the right timing for administering a survey? Because there are these surges, and of course, in December and January, there's a pretty significant Omicron surge. But this is after that. So now the cases are going down. We're entering in the latter part of February. And so basically it was over the course of 2 weeks that the respondents completed the survey.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And so like you say, it's very fresh. And so the impacts that we're feeling right now, the economy, I'm sure, are very prevalent to them when they took this survey. But it's heartening also to hear that they still have this strong connection, this strong faith in God. And in some cases, it's been increased. But the other side of that I noticed in the survey is that many of them have found almost a comfortable numb, if you will. I'm using that term loosely, in not attending Mass, though. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this is where we get into some of the more disappointing findings or disconcerting findings, really.
Sure.
We get into the Mass and some of the reasons that people don't anticipate, or they anticipate not attending Mass physically. So anyway, so a large number were observing Mass virtually. And that continues to this day, really. They're relying significantly on virtual Mass attendance. And ultimately, if we look specifically at the people who went to Mass weekly or more often before COVID, they're still going to be engaged with the Mass by either attending or observing virtually, every week, right? So I think the number was 69%, or no, sorry, 89%. 89% were still going to be observing or attending Mass every week. The problem is when you got into like, well, are you going to be physically present all the time? And that number came down significantly, came down to 61%. So really, from again, people in the pews all the time, right, before COVID, 6 out of 10 expect to be in the pews full time coming back. Mm-hmm. In a separate line of questioning, we asked them, so do you see yourself physically present at Mass in the next 3 months? And if they said no to that, we said, okay, well, why not? Or we asked why not. And that's where the real insight or information, I guess, really came to us in the data, which was that there were 2 buckets of information or of responses that they could select. One of them had to do with illness, vulnerability, having someone vulnerable in their lives, right, from a health perspective or in their household. So there were obviously people that selected that as a reason for not physically attending Mass. But then we had this other category of responses that had to do with convenience or preference. So I don't have to drive to Mass, right? I just got used to Mass, watching Mass. I don't have to participate in terms of the, singing, praying out loud, standing, kneeling, sitting, all of that. And that, I think it was 40% who selected only those reasons as reasons that they would not physically attend Mass, which are obviously all the wrong reasons. And that's a huge red flag and alert about this, what about the impact of the pandemic, right? My concern is that a lot of them are not going to come back because they're not expecting to come back thus far. And as we start shutting down virtual streaming of Masses, they don't have a compelling reason to go, right? If their reason for not going today is that it's easier, if you turn it off, then, well, it's easier to stay home, right? Or I can do anything else, but not. So anyway, so that's the big disappointment in the results, that we're seeing a lot of Catholics who are saying that, from a convenience perspective, virtual streaming of Masses has, made physical attendance in Mass a little bit less compelling and interesting for me.
Well, you touch on obviously the 2 main buckets there. Both of them, I think I've encountered either through friends or through family. I certainly have family members who are elderly, who feel, are concerned about their own safety and their own health and with the different variants that go around. But then also, it as my bishop, I've heard him say, it's going to be difficult to find a more comfortable seat than your own couch to watch Mass. And then, so the idea of, to the understanding the real presence of the Eucharist, or that need to be, one with the Eucharist, or be together in community. Somehow it feels as though we fail a little bit on the educational side of things as we formed Catholics, and in the need for community and in the need for the Eucharist. Did your I don't imagine your research touched too much on that, but that's been some of the themes that I've encountered in my own discussions with people.
Correct. So the research itself didn't, but the conclusion is I reached the same conclusion. I think in many respects we're paying the price for perhaps less than optimal catechesis around what the Mass is, because there is the Eucharistic component, there is the community component, there's a sacrificial component. Even if you're not taking communion, it's important for you to be in Mass, to participate in the sacrifice of the Mass. And people just don't understand that. And I went through another exercise with with another group around the Mass, and this existed before COVID, making time for sports for your children instead of going to Mass, right? And so that simply is another way in which it speaks to the fact that they don't understand. A lot of Catholics don't understand the why behind the presence of being at the Mass, and unfortunately, this is what we're seeing here pretty clearly, in my view.
Absolutely. Did your study touch a little bit on giving or further engagement beyond the life in the life of the church?
Not further engagement, but definitely on giving. We went into giving a little bit. One of the questions a couple of questions we asked was first whether or not how their giving was affected, I guess, by the pandemic.
Sure.
And we asked pre-pandemic and giving levels, and then what their existing level was. So basically the past 3 months, starting in February and going backwards. And basically what we found is that giving did go down, not a huge amount, but it did go down. So, our result of the giving amount at a median level, which is another measure of central tendency, similar to a mean. Let's say before the pandemic, they were giving $70 to their parish a month. Now they're at about $60 per month.
Okay.
So again, it's a decline. What does that work out to? Maybe 12 or 14%, something in that range.
Right.
Overall giving level has declined. And now I will say anecdotally, in talking with a few pastors about this, one of their observations has been that everyone saw this coming, right? Once the pandemic hit, they saw the financial impact that would happen at the parish level. And so a lot of parishes seem to have had a group of givers, of parishioners, who knew this and gave more, right?
Yes,
so
just to try
to kind of balance out a little bit about what they expected. But anyway, so as a whole, though, it's declined. And then the number that gave nothing has also increased, right? So that number went up. It used to be that, at least among our respondents, only 3% didn't give anything before the pandemic. Now that number's up to 10%, right? And so that's a more significant increase. But again, it's offset a little bit by some of the others who are giving a little bit more.
Yeah. I would argue that number might even be higher as far as those that don't give anything. In our experience in working with parishes, we find the average is 30 to 40% give something during the course of the year, but the vast majority of parishes, you see better than 50% of parishioners who are actually registered. They may not be attending Mass, but they're on the rolls and not giving anything financially to their parish. It's interesting.
Yes, well, and I think what was interesting is I want to tease that out at some point, because you have a lot who are registered but not attending Mass. So people register so that their kids can go through the sacraments, or maybe just habitually, but we know that the kids are being dropped off and they do not see Mass, right, on Sundays, even though they'll make the catechesis at a convenient time, right? So they can attend Mass and then go straight to catechesis, but they'll be dropped off and things like that. But I do want to get into that a little bit later. Well, not later today, but just later in a different study. But the other interesting thing, like statistically anyway, that I'd like to look into further is there is this phenomenon of overestimating and underestimating, right? Overestimating positive behaviors, underestimating negative behaviors, that at some point is a nut that we need to crack that I haven't seen cracked in the Catholic world. So in the commercial world, people, if you ask, well, what percent of your patients would be prescribed this drug? There's a discounting formula that we use because it's likely they're overestimating that figure, but there's a process for that. I think we can do the same in the Catholic Church. And so I'm going to start, engaging a few folks into how best to do that so that we can get an accurate forecast of that, because it is really based on self-perception and self statement, right? More than anything else.
Absolutely. And I know that many parishes also, they struggle with just maintaining good records on folks, and just because of living and
That's
help
true.
in the office, and just maybe it hasn't been a priority, but certainly good data on that is sometimes a challenge to find. We found in our work with different dioceses and different parishes around the country that a much greater percentage of people are now giving online than ever before. And that may contribute why it just didn't drop off a cliff. Some dioceses are now fully handling all parish giving, and they have that option. You can go to the diocesan website, select your parish, and make your weekly contribution. And but many others are doing it on their own and engaging different companies. And I don't know, did you guys get into the method by which people give, or just the giving overall at this point?
Just the giving overall at
Yeah.
this point.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say one positive note on the future intent to give.
Yeah.
While most expect to give at the same level they're currently giving at, those who will increase their giving are greater than those who say that they will decrease their future giving. So again,
Right.
I think we'll further close that gap, from where we are now in pre-COVID. So that's a little bit of positive news as well.
That's wonderful. You said you've talked to some pastors about the results. I know the results are still very fresh, but what's some of the feedback that you've received from this study?
Well, a little bit of shock
Mhm.
at some of the figures we discussed before, and
Yeah.
concern about the numbers who are not expecting to come back, and then some of the reasons that they're not. So that was a big concern. And one of the questions that has come up has been, well, do we continue streaming? Well, the first question was, are people watching the streams? And I think the answer is yes to that. But then the other question is, do we need to continue? And what I've been telling them is, I think there are two reasons to continue. I understand why you would argue not to, which is to get them into church, right? Which is
Sure.
Makes perfect sense. But my recommendation to continue are twofold. One is, you do have people who are, have legitimate health concerns, and live with people who have vulnerable, health issues.
Yes.
And so that's a way to minister and keep them connected. But then the other is for those who are selecting convenience reasons. I think this is the only thread we have to them. And so if we shut it out, we shut it down, then we've lost them.
Right.
And I guess the second part to that point is that, can we do something to help them in the streaming? So for example, welcoming them or inviting them back, right? At the beginning, the priests typically say something, thank you for being here to any visitors, thank you for here. Please see me after mass, so we could talk a little bit more, whatever the case may be. Can we also say, if you're streaming and you've been thinking about coming back and you haven't, please come back, right? We want you here. It's good for you, not to get into catechesis, but just to invite them back. Yes. Plant the seed, right? Mm-hmm. Some people have safety concerns, which you can say, you can answer and say, please know that we have these procedures or processes in our parish, right? We have the ushers that, that help with the communion, and we still have a specific communion process for that. We've got hand sanitizers, whatever the case may be. Right. We have an area that people can sit and wear masks if they want to be, further separated from everyone else, whatever. That'll be one way. But I think those are some of the short-term kind of fixes. Like you've got a channel of communication, an open line of communication with them. But I think something then longer term needs to be done around the better understanding of the Mass, because there might be another pandemic, who knows, and we'll have to shut down again, hopefully not. But it's still good for the soul for them to better understand the Mass and why they need to be there. And if they don't, that's obviously a problem.
I couldn't agree more. And maybe another thing for them to mention is we have Eucharistic ministers who are willing to bring the Eucharist to you. And so, we're going to put a button, or we're going to put a form here, send us an email, give us a call if you would like someone to bring the Eucharist. And that's maybe another way of engaging people and just understanding their comfort level. The Eucharistic minister could wear a mask and go through any safety precautions needed, but it's just another way of engaging them in conversation. I agree. Getting rid of the streaming, I don't know that if you stop the streaming, that means they're going to just automatically come back to Mass. I agree with your logic. And I think more than likely, they'll just find another parish or another church that is streaming, and then you will have lost that person in your community. So keeping that service. Maybe you don't need to stream every mass. Maybe you're just streaming one mass and it's recorded and it's available. But I completely agree.
One question I wish I'd asked is, let's assume your parish stops streaming. What would you do? Find another parish that streams, or just give up, right? Stop. Because that's the question I have. Is I just don't know what they'll do. So we'll see. I think another thing that parishes can do, and I'm sure someone has this available, is make short videos about the Mass available to people on their website, put a link in their bulletins, send it out to email to people, right? So that they understand. I think it's affirming for those who may already know it, right, and are physically present, and then educational for those who are not. But again, I'm not familiar with that type of video or resource. So, and I guess the reason that's important is because I'm not putting the onus on the parishes by having to create that, which would be very difficult, right, and time consuming and expensive. But if one exists out there, and I'm maybe I'll look into some resources and see about posting them on my website as well as a resource to consider, because I think catechesis around the Mass to me is the big thing that came out of this report, is how desperately that's needed.
I had my bishop in the Diocese of Allentown on our podcast last year, and around our 60th anniversary as a diocese, he named the theme "Return to the Real Presence." And that's been the theme Eucharistically throughout the year. They've done a number of talks, and that's just been kind of they've increased time around adoration. But it's been a diocesan-wide effort, and I agree, it's difficult to put all of that on the parish, all that educational piece. It's great if it's supported through the diocese, but I'm sure, as you said, there are other resources available to parishes that will help them reinforce that message of the real presence, of the need for Mass, of the whole catechesis piece. So important.
Right. And then you've got social media, because a lot of people are on social media now, pastors and associate pastors, and whether it be Facebook or Instagram, depending on the generation you're looking to hit. Some of them are active now. How do you get them to be followed? I guess anyway, it's a problem that can be solved. I think at least some of the short-term actions can be solved, and then, like I said, there's also a need for some longer term.
One of the challenges that I've just in my conversation with pastors and through some folks who work at the diocesan level is that some pastors, our pastors were heroic during the pandemic, and many of them didn't understand or know about the technology of streaming at the time, but they made it happen, right? They found somebody in the parish that helped them get their masses online. And it was just heartwarming to see how many of them used their own Facebook page or got their parishes online. My own pastor had our parish wired with Wi-Fi so that he could then stream us on Facebook and on YouTube. It's just been tremendous. But what I've heard from folks now that we're on the other side a little bit of the pandemic is just the stress, I think, sometimes that might be on our pastors, in that there were all these services now that I provided during the pandemic, but now we're coming back in person. Now I have to provide all the services that were, that I created during the pandemic, but now I have to do all the ones that I had to provide while we were in person. So my heart goes out to the pastors from that perspective, because it's a lot of pressure to really navigate this changing world that we're in right now. Are you seeing some of that?
I am, and I alluded to a meeting I attended recently at our local parish, which is really about family faith formation, or just faith formation in general. And there's a lot that they have to consider. Just you take just faith formation, and that's a lot to chew on, and you layer that on, layer the fact that that's on top of the pandemic kind of world in reality, or post-pandemic, hopefully at some point soon, reality that we're in. And so I agree. I do feel for them, which is, so with this information, I hope to help them in some way, not overwhelm them. But again, it's information that they need to help prioritize, right? So like, what are the priorities? And this is one input into, several inputs that they have, I would imagine, to help them prioritize, because I think that's huge, because you can't do everything. And so so what's your priority? And I think it's a very effective when you can prioritize in some way, or think about who are we most trying to serve. What is it? Rebuilt. There's a book, Rebuilt, from the Church of the Nativity. It's actually not too far from my house. And one of the things that they did, it's in the church is located in a town called Timonium, Maryland. So what they did is they came up with a persona, Timonium Tim, right?
Yep.
And so they described him, he's married or divorced or whatever the situation would be, has kids, doesn't, but they, in Catholic knowledge, right, Catholicity, and they said, we're going to focus on Timonium Tim. So everything we do revolves around Tim, right? And then they go off a little bit from that, and that it's not going to just serve Tim, but basically the idea behind that was like having a grounding, right? And then a prioritization that they could apply to that helped a lot in the decision making that they did as a parish.
It's ironic you mentioned that book. So I started our podcast here 5 years ago, and on my very first episode, I drove down to Timonium, Maryland, and I visited Church of the Nativity. So my first 2 episodes of Advancing Our Church, if anybody wants to go way back, was a 2-part episode with Father Michael White and the administrator of the parish. And I got to interview some of the parishioners there and some of the folks in the cafe that they have outside. And that was while they were building the big parish, the big church building that they constructed a couple of years ago. But I couldn't agree more, because it really does. And they say in the book that it was a little off-putting to some people, because people liked things the way they were, because it was kind of like a comfortable shoe that you put on, but was it really reaching people? And so it really redirecting that to who's not here that should be here, and how do we center our ministry around the weekend homily, around the weekend service, the weekend experience, I think is how they framed it in the book. And how do we make ourselves a more welcoming community, and really, whether it's offering babysitting for the really younger ones in the back, or a cafe for young adults to be more hospitable, or whatever it was. You saw that when I drove in, you saw people out in the parking lot directing cars and welcoming you from the moment you got out of your car to the moment you sat in your pew. It's an amazing place. If anyone's in the area and wants to run down and see the Church of the Nativity, incredible place, incredible.
I agree. And I was there before they built the new parish. So I haven't been there since, but I'll make a trip. It's only 40 minutes from where we are.
Not bad. Well, we're going to put a link to the full report, certainly in the show notes, as I said at the top of the show. And I would encourage anyone, as we said, to download the report, and maybe even as a parish, as a finance council, a stewardship committee, a pastoral council, whatever, just as different groups take a look at it and see what are the different gems that you can pull out and make some of those items actionable. But Hans, what's next for Vinea Research? What do you have on the horizon?
So we're going through a process of identifying what future studies we want to do.
Okay.
I did administer last fall a survey on the kerygma, excuse me, which is basically about what parts of the kerygma do people understand and believe in, and where do they struggle maybe a little bit. And obviously I don't call it the kerygma, I just go into the elements of the kerygma.
Yeah.
So I'll be reporting out on that in the next month or so. Great. But then like at the same time, we're doing a parallel track to identify what the next survey is. I'm in a couple of conversations, or one conversation in particular, with another partner organization to see if it's not just Vinea, but others that are kind of contributing to the identification of different study topics that we might do in the future. So I plan to do a lot more of that. Plus, most of our work up until now has been with individual apostolates or the USCCB or individual organizations, basically. This is the first public one, I guess, that we're doing. So we'll still continue our work with privately commissioned work, but then also want to make some projects available, more publicly
to the general public, which is wonderful. And the more organizations you work with, the more great expertise and wonderful data you're going to bring to all the projects that you're working on. So that's just wonderful. Well, maybe we'll have the opportunity to work together at some point in the future.
I hope so.
Wonderful. Well, Hans, I want to thank you for being on Advancing Our Church. Thank you for all you're doing in service to the church. Thank you for making the transition from the commercial industry and bringing all of your great expertise and knowledge to the world of the church. And so grateful to you for sharing this report publicly with all of us.
Thank you. It's very rewarding for me to be, in my early 50s and have a new energy, I guess, in my career, right? From taking, all that I learned over those couple of decades and applying it to the church. It's really incredibly rewarding.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, and God bless you in all of your work. And we'll stay in touch, and maybe we'll have you back for the next one.
Sounds great, Jeff. Thanks so much.
God bless.
All right. God bless.
I want to thank Hans for joining us on our show today. I will leave a link to the study in the show notes of this episode and a link to Venea's website. Thank you again for joining us today, Hans, and thank you for all the important work that you do to serve our church. If this is your first time listening to Advancing Our Church, I hope you'll stick around and subscribe. You can find us on all places where you download your favorite podcasts. You can find us on YouTube. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. And for more information about our show, of course, please visit us at advancingourchurch.com. Well, that's our show this week. Special thanks to Podastery Studios for another great show. And if you'd like to help our show, please leave us a rating wherever you downloaded this podcast. Advancing Our Church is a production of Changing Our World, and we are a fundraising and social impact consulting firm that has been advising both nonprofits and corporations for more than 2 decades. For more information, please visit us at changingourworld.com. Well, that's it for me, everybody. Have a terrific week. God bless. We'll see you back here in 2 weeks.